You ever notice while playing Rex that it's harder to launch an ATG? Or maybe you're playing Commando and you notice that it's way easier to get big bleed stacks on compared to Huntress? You probably think you're just getting unlucky with your item procs, but there's actually a secret mechanic in the game that dictates your runs and how strong you become. This secret part of the game that you would never learn about from just playing is proc coefficients. You might have heard people talk about them, but let's get into what they actually mean and how they affect your run. So this is a concept that the game never teaches you, but plays a big part in what items you should invest in depending on your survivor and current build. Proc coefficients are the secret multiplier that affects an item's chance to proc off an ability. So the smaller the coefficient, the chance of activating said effect goes down. The higher the coefficient, the higher the chance is. Tri-tip daggers are a great one to start off with, since most people are aware each stack adds 10% chance to apply a stack of bleed. But that's before proc multiplication. For example, Commando has a 1.0 proc coefficient for his primary attack. So a single tri-tip dagger at 10% base bleed chance will be multiplied by 1.0. Giving Commando a 10% chance to bleed. But Rex has a 0.5 proc coefficient with their primary attack. So a single tri-tip dagger at 10% base bleed chance will be multiplied by 0.5, halving the base chance of the tri-tip, giving Rex a 5% chance to bleed with this single dagger. This means Rex needs 20 daggers to max bleed out. Alright, now let's up the amount of daggers that we have. So Huntress has a 0.7 proc coefficient with Flurry. So if she has 10 tri-tip daggers adding up to 100% base bleed chance, it is still multiplied by the attack proc coefficient, which comes out to 70% chance to bleed. Everyone has their own idea of how to deal with numbers on the fly, but I prefer to think of proc coefficients as percentages. So 0.5 is 50%. 0.75 is 75%, and so on. It's easier for me to think of it this way and how they relate to the base chance an item in your inventory has to proc. Say if you have 10 sticky bombs adding up to 50% base chance, your 0.5 proc chance on Rex's primary attack makes that a 25% instead. It does get more complicated with less even numbers, but even getting a rough idea of what you have or need in your build will always help. Now that you know the idea of proc coefficients, there are some rules about them you should know about as well. The first of these rules is that critical hits as a whole do not take your proc coefficient into consideration. As long as the attack has a proc coefficient, it can crit at whatever base chance your item currently adds up to. The exception to this rule is Railgunner, who has 100% crit on weak points and always has 0% crit chance on non-weak point hits due to her passive. It's important to note that void crits from Lost Seers lenses do not work the same way as regular crit from Lensmaker's glasses. Instead, they roll off of proc coefficients just like ATGs or bleed or any other proc item. Rule 2. For multi-pellet attacks, each pellet has the proc coefficient applied to them separately, shown in this format. The only items exempt from this rule are Lost Seers lenses and Lensmaker's glasses. Both crit and void crit will be applied to the entirety of the multi-pellet attack if proc, instead of rolling separately for each pellet like every other item will. Rule 3, for any damage over time, whether that be from poison, blight, bleed, needle tick, etc., they are not able to proc items per tick since every damage over time in the game has a 0.0 proc coefficient. Lastly, we have Rule 4, any AoE or piercing attacks / items will have their proc coefficient applied to each enemy that is hit by the single attack. For example, you can proc up to 4 ATG missiles in a single Commando frag grenade if 4 enemies are hit. Here's a list of some of the piercing and AoE attacks that the survivors and items have. Alright, now let's get into some interesting effects and interactions that proc coefficients have. One of these is that the duration of bleed is actually dependent on your proc coefficient, meaning a hit with a 1.0 proc coefficient, let's say Commando's primary attack, will have a 3-second bleed duration, while Rex's primary attack with a 0.5 proc coefficient will only have a 1.5 second bleed. And Railgunner's supercharged with a 3.0 proc coefficient will have a 9-second bleed. That's right, I said it, bleed Railgunner. The same rule is true for bleed that is applied by a crit with Shatter Spleen as well, so no matter how you bleed an enemy, whether it be from your survivor's skills or items that proc it, it will take the proc coefficient of the attack into consideration. Another interaction that you might not know about is the Symbiotic Scorpion being reliant on proc coefficients in order to apply its debuff. It's not a guaranteed proc, so Captain's primary with a 0.75 proc coefficient will have a 75% chance to proc the Scorpion debuff for each of its 8 pellets. Brilliant Behemoth is also affected by proc coefficients, but probably not in the way you may think. Behemoth has a 0.0 proc coefficient, so nothing will ever proc off of it except for 2 specific things. The first is Lost Seer's Lenses. If your attack rolls to proc Lost Seer's Lenses, which essentially deletes the enemy, that proc will be applied to the entirety of the Behemoth radius, including the ability to proc it on boss enemies, which is not able to happen unless using this Behemoth interaction. Mithrix is the only enemy that is not able to be insta-killed using this tech, meaning special bosses like Aurelian Knight and AWU, or Alloy Worship Unit, are able to be insta-killed by this interaction. The secondary interaction between Behemoth and proc coefficients is that its radius scales with your proc coefficient. This one's pretty basic. The higher the proc coefficient your attack has, the larger the radius of the Behemoth explosion. Something else that proc coefficients affect that is really important to note is that it affects how much HP you actually heal for while using Leeching Seed and Harvester's Scythe. The amount you are supposed to heal for based on the item's description is actually multiplied by the proc coefficient of the attack that triggers the heal. Meaning, if we have 1 Leeching Seed, we'd expect to gain, well, 1 HP, right? But if we're multi using Nail Gun, which has a 0.6 proc coefficient, we will only be healing for 0.6 HP per attack. Same thing goes for Harvester Scythe. A single scythe should heal you for 8 HP per critical hit, but after proc multiplication, will actually only heal for 4.8 HP per critical hit using Multi's Nail Gun. This is why I personally don't rely on Leeching Seed and Harvester Scythe as my primary source of healing, since it does get affected and reduced by proc coefficients depending on which attack you use. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to stack those. Important to note that 57 Leaf Clover does increase proc chance by re-rolling your proc if it does not initially proc. For example, if I have 1 ATG as Commando, that is a 10% chance to proc with his primary attack. Now let's say it would have not procced an ATG from a single hit. The Clover will re-roll the chance to proc again from that initial hit. So the initial roll of 10% failed initially, but Clover will give you another 10% chance to launch that ATG from that hit. So this means that Clover does not affect proc coefficients and their effects, such as bleed duration or Behemoth radius, but it does allow for more chances to proc items. And if you're also wondering about purity, the effect is the inverse of Clover, reducing the proc chance, but the coefficients are unaffected as well, just like Clover. Now this video was primarily about survivors and their proc coefficients for their skills, but items also have proc coefficients. Every single item that creates and continues proc chains all have their own on-hit proc coefficient. If you want to learn more about proc chains and how proc coefficients affect your items on hit effects, I highly recommend checking out Disputed Origins' video on proc chains. He does a very good job of adding on to this topic from the item side of things, so again, go check his video out, and I'll throw a link in the description as well. But that about wraps up all the main rules and effects that proc coefficients are constantly altering your runs with. Make sure to reference the link in the description, which has a complete list of every skill and item and their corresponding proc coefficients. I do plan on going more in depth about each survivor when it comes to their proc coefficients and how items synergize with them specifically, so be sure to subscribe and keep a lookout for those in the future. Leave a comment on anything you think I might have missed, and I hope I was able to clear up and teach you guys a thing or two. Thanks for watching, and peace out.